Hola, Kid Nate of BloodyElbow.com. I'm joined by Frank Shamrock, my all-time favorite cage fighter and mixed martial artist. Thanks for joining us, Frank.
Nice to be here.
And we are going to talk about Frank's book, Uncaged. That's right, I got the title right, by Frank Shamrock. This tells the story of his most amazing life as he arose from basically an orphan, definitely a street kid, all the way to the undefeated champion of the UFC, and somebody who definitely should be in the UFC Hall of Fame, but is not for political reasons that we'll go into. But first off, let's ask you, what made you decide to write a book?
It just seemed like it was time. I could see my fighting career was coming to an end, and my ability to kind of, influence people, inspire people, and encourage people was coming to an end. And I had extra time on my hands, so I started writing. I started writing a book, and I was a huge reader. I loved reading when I was a kid. It's the thing that gave me a lot of comfort and solace in my crazy, challenging life. So I was always looking for that book, that kind of, that was about my life. I was always looking for that story that was, somewhat mine, and was very honest and real and raw. And I just never found it. And then as I was writing my book, I realized, oh my God, I'm creating the book. And then the rest is history, I guess.
So if there was a kid like you out there somewhere, a young athletic person who's struggling with a tough home life, what would be the one thing you'd hope they'd take away from the book?
There's no right or wrong way to, survive this thing, but there's some definite guidelines you can stick by, and those are, the principles of martial arts, and just being a good person and getting a good community. I think a lot of these guys just come from, I came from a bad community, so I know when you come from a place that's broken, you usually end up in a broken place because there's just no tools to get you from, broken to fixed.
So your childhood saga, you ended up doing prison time after bouncing in and out of different institutions. Do you regret any of those crimes that you committed, or do you feel like that it was all part of a path that led you to where you were supposed to be, and that everything had a happy ending? Is there anything you would undo?
Well, yeah, I'm sure I know I stole from a lot of people and did a lot of crappy things to a lot of people. So if I could, I would undo that. Because I didn't realize the effect I was having on the world around me, as I was going through this journey, because I was concerned about myself and trying to survive, and I grew up surviving, so I didn't know another way. I didn't know how it was, making other people feel. Now I'm a bit older, I realize it, and I feel like a total, knucklehead for doing it. But I can't do anything about the past. I can only be a better person and try to help people.
So at the end of that saga, you ended up in the Bob Shamrock's Home for Boys. This was a pretty unusual setup. Sort of in Texas, we've got something called the Boys Ranch, or there's the legendary Boys Town. This was one of those things where Bob Shamrock took in a lot of kids who didn't have any place else to go. How much did that mean to you in your life?
Well, it was huge. Bob was my first, father figure that sort of stuck around, and it wasn't, weird strings attached, or, it was consistent. Everything was consistent, and it was all based on love. Bob was just, he loved helping kids, and he couldn't have boys of his own. So he was like, I'm just going to have tons of other boys then. So, he genuinely had extra love, and you could feel it. It was just totally inspiring. And, he was the first guy to stand up and, tell me some things that were right and wrong and stand by them himself. And they meant a lot to me.
So one of the most disturbing things in the book, however, was that you talk about being abused by your stepfather and being neglected, and you bounced around from your mom's house to your dad's house, so were never really taken care of. But the only mention of sexual molestation actually happened while you were under Bob Shamrock's care. One of the other coaches or aides at his establishment actually molested you. What do you have conflicting emotions about that? Do you feel like Bob Shamrock let you down, or?
No, I don't have any, ill will or emotions towards Bob on that. For me, I didn't know enough about my own sexuality, what was going on, to sort of, realize. I know it was weird, and it made me very uncomfortable. And, it happened twice, and after that, I was like, yeah, stay away from this dude. But I was young, like I didn't get it, didn't get the, I liked to drink. I was an alcoholic when I was a really young man. And I like to drink, and if you gave me drink, I'd hang out with you. This guy saw an opportunity there. It didn't creep me out, but the reason why I put it in the book is there's a lot of people that have secrets like this, and they're carrying them around with them, and they're weighing them down in life, and it's like people are like, oh, I can't do this because of that, and it's like, no, there is no this because of that. You can do anything you want, and if that's weighing you down, then get rid of it. And that was a process for me. I had to get rid of it, and I wanted people to know it's all right.
Cool. I got to, as somebody else, who survived some stuff in childhood like that, I got to take my hat off, and I appreciate you coming forward with that. And I think it makes it easier for everybody who's lived through experiences like that. And for kids that might be going for things like that, it's important to know you're not doing anything wrong, and these adults are the ones that are doing something wrong, and it's nothing to be hidden. So I really appreciate that, and I think that's an important part of your book. But let's segue to the next step in your life. Bob Shamrock then introduces you, basically hands you over to Ken Shamrock, who was also his adopted son. And as a fan in the 90s, I had this mythological viewpoint of the Lion's Den. I imagined it as sort of like, Olympus for MMA fighters. But to hear the actual story, you were basically beat up by Ken as you're welcome to the Lion's Den. What was that like? Like just being thrown into the gym and getting a sustained ass whipping?
It was like the rest of my life. It wasn't, besides the impression it made, which, psychologically, sorry, that's my cat. Psychologically and physically, it just made a huge impression on me because I thought, I thought I was a criminal, and I've been to prison, and it's just, it woke me up that, you could have this power, that, that you could exercise it in certain ways. And I just was, dude, Sasha, you have to go. I was just unaware that martial arts had that type of power. And I went through my life being taken advantage of, powerless. And it's like I was always, I watched martial arts shows, and I was always like, oh, if I just knew this and that. And, I was a typical kid, but I was very lost and damaged. So the moment I realized, oh, my God, like this guy just did this to me. And further, someone taught him, and I could learn that. And it could be a tool, and it could be a way. And plus, no one will ever do that to me again. And that to me was one of the biggest things is, once you have someone really kick your ass, it just changes how you see things, whether it's physically or, psychologically. It's just, it changed me.
Do you feel like that's in any way, shape, or form a valid form of training today? Like, is there any place of that teaches that way? And do you think there's any validity to it?
Yeah. There's people that need a good ass kick. I needed a good ass kick. If I would have went in there and cruised through that and, done well and whatever, I would have been a monster because I had no understanding of anything. I was just a total raw person. The hardest part of this whole journey is getting fame and money and all this stuff that you always wanted, and then realizing you got to manage it and be a normal person and, be kind and considerate. So, for me, I always just tried to stay in the moment on this whole journey. So because it was so easy to get distracted and go over to whatever was bad.
So, and then as you talk about in the book that as you grew with the Lion's Den, there were never really teaching sessions. Ken would just do holds to you. He would just execute holds on you, and you would have to try to piece together after the fact. You talk about drawing pictures of the holds he was using. Did you have any awareness of the theoretical background? Did he ever say this is catch wrestling and this is part of a tradition? And did he tell you about Karl Gotch or Fujiwara or any of the guys that taught him or the tradition? Did it just seem like something Ken was doing that was coming out of nowhere?
I didn't. He didn't have a lot of tradition teachings. It wasn't because we weren't martial arts. I think, in martial arts, we have all this tradition, we have all this history, and we didn't. Ken was making it up. We were all making it up. So we didn't have that, thing going on. I learned most of my stuff from Jason DeLucia because Jason DeLucia was a martial artist and he had all the history, he had all the stuff. And so most of my information I got from him.
And so DeLucia was somebody who actually came from, I believe, the Five Animals style Kung Fu. Ooh. And then he challenged Hoist Gracie. DeLucia is in one of the famous Gracie's in Action videotapes. And then, he realized by getting his ass kicked by the Gracies, that there was more to this, and eventually joined up with the Lions Den. So, looking back on it now, was he teaching you any of the kung fu, or had he dismissed with that entirely and was focused solely on submission wrestling, or do you have a feel for the context of that?
He he had still trained and stuff, but he didn't show me anything. I gotta go answer this door. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's all right. All right, we're back. So, from the Lions Den, you then went and trained in Japan, and the story of going over to Japan and training, you were training under Funaki and Suzuki, the founders of Pancrase. They weren't, you spoke no Japanese. I mean, the isolation of that just sounds incredible. Tell a story about just stalking people that you thought might speak English in the subway.
Well, weirdly enough, if you've ever seen Lost in Translation with Bill Murray, it was exactly like that. Like I was, I'd been in prison, I'd done all these things, but I was suddenly displaced in another country with no money or connection, or it was just bizarro. And I'd borrow the bike, I'd ride down to the subway, and I'd look for anybody with, blonde hair or anybody that looked like they were English or anything, and I'd say, "Hey, how you doing?" Spark up a conversation with them, which in Japan is totally foreign. You never approach somebody that you don't have a, relationship or an interest or something. So, but yeah, it was I did 3.5 years in prison, and those 8 weeks were as lonely or more than that entire time. It was just a whole isolation from the world. It was bizarre. Wonderful preparation for fighting, but just socially, it was not. I didn't feel good about it. It was sad.
So essentially, on the training aspect, was it basically a continuation of the experience at the Lions Den? They were just essentially attacking you, grappling with you, inflicting holds on you. No, with the language barrier, no explanation of the theoretical background or the history of where this art came from?
Well, they were very, ritualistic. Japanese, of course, were very ritualistic. So most of that was conditioning, and then, mat drills and rope drills, and many of the other athletic conditioning stuff that had come from the Lions Den that Ken had us do as conditioning. But they had a little more teaching. The senior guy, Suzuki and stuff, would come in, and he was very clever with objects. So he taught me the ball, the balance and control theory with like a ball and a ruler. And he's like, "Get the ruler, get the ball." And he had like a whole Zen moment where he explained the theory of balance and control in submission wrestling. And it made sense. It was brilliant. He was also the guy that gave me considerable advice on taking down Boss Rutten in our first fight. Because I didn't have a strong takedown. I never wrestled in my life. And, I didn't really get it. The boss was going to kick my face off if I didn't get him to the ground. And Suzuki's like, no, you need to, really get this down. And he's the guy that really advised me, if boss moves at all, you start shooting, you take him down. So he was very beneficial in that way. But it was very, Ken just didn't articulate well. He wasn't a good, and it's not his fault. He didn't have that asset, where he could look at something and break it down. He was more of a soldier. You told him 5, and he lined 5 up and gave them to you. So it was different learning from Ken. Japanese were insightful and very creative and trying to get me to figure it out. And then I had my little friend Ito, which was pretty helpful because he spoke pretty good English.
Did you ever meet Karl Gotch?
No.
What about Fujiwara?
Fujiwara, I met, but never got to hang out with or do anything.
Did they make it clear that he was the one that had taught Funaki and Suzuki the catch wrestling, or was that?
Yes, I believe it was Fujiwara, Karl Gotch, one other guy, and then a young boy that were up there. Each morning we bowed to him and warmed up and made an offering and acknowledgement. Yeah. It was so crazy to go from, locked up in prison, and then 8 months later, after getting beat up and training my life off, I'm, standing in line with the Japanese, bowing to, who knows, for whatever reason, and training all day. It was crazy.
When you teach martial arts today, do you incorporate any of that sort of traditional respect and the bowing and the rituals into your teachings?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't come from there, but I realized on my journey why it's important. Because people like me, I didn't understand the power when I first got involved, and I didn't understand the responsibility when I first got involved. And now that I do, I get it.
Do jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu in particular has gotten an enormous amount of publicity and has entered the public consciousness. Catch wrestling, on the other hand, has very little name ID, even with hardcore fans of martial
Yeah.
arts. Do you feel like, do you have any insight on why do you think catch wrestling has sort of been ignored when it's, at least in my mind, a 25-30% parent of modern martial arts?
Yeah, it just didn't get the branding and the opportunity. The UFC made BJJ, popular and cool. And I mean, catch wrestling's been around forever. It was the original entertainment. That's what you went and saw at the fair. You wrestled the big guy. It's too hard. It's too rough. And, it never had that big branding moment.
Is there anybody fighting today that you think is carrying the torch of catch wrestling in a way that makes you proud?
I don't even know anybody who's fighting doing catch wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, Josh Barnett's about the only guy.
Yeah, Josh, he's still out there, and I mean, you've seen what he's been able to do, even with the years off. It was a beautiful. It is a beautiful system of just systematic destruction through a series of moves and positions, and there's something very beautiful about that if you're a grappling fan.
When you teach martial arts today, how much of your book of secrets do you consider to have come from the catch wrestling tradition?
Well, I would say it's probably 20% of our fabric. I started in the catch wrestling, and then I trained with Maurice Smith at kickboxing, and then I did sambo, and then I did jiu-jitsu, and then I did judo, and then I did wrestling. I did boxing, kickboxing. Yeah.
20%.
Yeah.
Out of the guys you fought in Pancrase, is there anybody you fought that you feel like is a lot tougher and deserves to be remembered more? I mean, everybody talks about you, Ken Shamrock, Boss Rutten, Funaki, Suzuki, but there are a lot of other tough guys in there. Who do you think out of the old school Pancrase guys deserves a shout out?
Guy Mesger was just a stud back in the day. I mean, even much later into his years, and there were so many tough guys that went through Pancrase. So Yuki Kondo was the first guy to ever kick me in the face and knock me out of the ring. That kid had amazing talent. There was a lot of guys that grew out of there.
Do you have any thoughts about why Japanese fighters haven't stayed competitive? Do you feel like it's just the business or something in their training, or any thoughts on that? Why we haven't seen a second Sakuraba?
Well, I think it's technology and opportunity and location. All the training and stuff is happening here. All the looking for a 9-volt battery. All the stuff is here. All the information, all the hard training, all the focus. When you start traveling around Europe and Japan and stuff, you see the fragmentation in the arts and the styles, and they're not complete. Sakuraba came along at a unique time when stars were aligning and promotions were aligning. And he had a great following and a great, background. And then he had a style and a system. We were the same. We came from the same lineage. He had a style and a system that was fairly complete. His striking wasn't the greatest, and he made up for it with being a good wrestler. But he had all the components necessary to, put together a game. And he just went out and worked it.
I was going to segue chronologically, but while we're talking about Sakuraba, he's kind of the one that got away. He's the fight that you say you wanted. He's widely considered to be the greatest mixed martial arts artist of all time, definitely of his era. You likewise are I consider you to be the peak, from 97 to 99, definitely the pinnacle of mixed martial arts. How would you have beat? What was your game plan for Sakuraba? Had you gotten that far? What were you seeing there that you thought you could exploit?
I thought with Sakuraba that I could work his game against him, and that is sit low, box heavy, and then when he comes in to wrestle, I'll turn my back on him.
Turtle up against him.
Yeah, and sit and turn. Well, I was never a great wrestler, but I had a lot of confidence going through the center and throwing my hips out the side. So, and I always thought it would be the least thing he would expect. You know what I mean? It would be the last thing, so I thought I'd do it first. Yeah.
I'm really thrilled to ask you that question because that's awesome. But we'll get back to the chronological thing. So after your time in Pancrase, you had a falling out with Ken. And then you partnered with Maurice Smith, and together with Chiyoshi Kasaka, you formed a group called the Alliance. What was it that the Alliance was doing differently from what you had learned in the Lion's Den and in the Pancrase Academy that took your game to the next level?
Well, we had Maurice Smith, who had 20 years already of kickboxing and as a champion, and then he also understood a lot of cardiovascular and muscular conditioning. So he shored up that problem for me, which was I was always getting tired of grappling. And then TK had a different style of guard work and also kind of a different style of wrestling work. And being that I wasn't a strong wrestler, I was always looking to modify my guard because holding big guys in my guard didn't help me all that much as the sport was evolving. So I was learning ways to get them on top of me and manipulate their bodies and get them away from me so I could get to what my evolving skill set which was striking. So Maurice and I had been training for years. Ken was supposed to teach him grappling after Maurice taught him kickboxing, and that didn't happen. So we got put together, instant friends. And then I was going to fight Kosaka. And Maurice is telling me, oh, he's a wonderful guy. And I'm like, I'm going to fight him. What are you trying to, like, don't sell him to me. I got to go fight the guy. And he's like, no, you don't understand. I really want you to, watch him while you're fighting him. I'm like, what are you talking about? So I studied him up and I see what he was talking about. And he had that component of the guard that we were missing, which was to make him more active. And we all just gel. After I fought him, he came back out like Tito did and everybody else. And we all just kind of gelled. And for years, we were this sort of wrecking machine.
And so that triggered what I consider, one of the great all-time runs in MMA, where you reeled off this series of victories. First, you had a fight, though, with John Lober in Hawaii. That was your first no-holds-barred fight, which is what we called it at the time. And you talk about that and pretty extensive. Like, do you think it was, Lober ultimately won that fight. Do you think it was just the shock of going from Pancrase, which was a modified form with no punching to the closed fist punching to the face, no hitting on the ground? Do you think it was just the shock of no holds barred for the first time, or do you think that Lober had something to teach you that you needed to learn?
Oh, there was something I needed to learn there because I was still in this weird denial phase where I was going to beat people up without hurting them, which didn't make any sense, and that was sort of my justification to go out there and fight the way I did. I'd always try to choke people. I'd always try to finish them in ways that wouldn't hurt them. But it was just a psychological problem I had. I realized after that fight that, after the abuse that I had as a kid, I didn't want to hurt people. I was afraid to hurt people and what that meant about me. And like, it was this heavy, psychological issue that I really needed to deal with. And I grew up in that fight, because I was walking around like I was a professional fighter. I wasn't. I wasn't ready to, do what had to be done out there, to swing the sword. And I had to come to terms with that. And it took, I think that fight was 20 minutes. It took 20 minutes of John Lober beating on me for me to figure out that, it's a decision you make and, you go with all your heart. And after that, I did.
And so the next fight you had was Enson Inoue in Vale-Tudo, Japan, which was a spin-off of Shudo that fought no-holds-barred rules. And Inoue at the time, he was a half Hawaiian, half Japanese guy, big guy, 6 foot tall, and I'm just speculating here, but it looks like he had just begun using supplements or something to add on a lot of muscle mass. But he had a jiu-jitsu background, and you guys had one of the all-time, great brawls, wherein he was on top of you for a long time, and you survived that. What were you thinking when Enson Inoue had you in mount for sustained periods of time? Were you comfortable or were you scared?
I was scared. And I trained for it. I wasn't a good jiu-jitsu guy, and I wasn't a good wrestler guy. I was a good sort of grappler guy. So I was always ending up in positions that weren't that good for me. And I was always going there and thinking, well, I might as well start from here and figure a way out. So I did a lot of training being mounted, and I understood what could happen. But I'd never been in the situation as intense as that with someone as strong as that. And he mounted me for minutes. He was, he was elbowing my face in and stuff. And it was a big gut check for me to get out from there and then to, go swinging like we did.
And from your narrative of the fight in the book, the fight ends with this Donnybrook on the feet that you came out ahead on. You don't say in the book, like, did you feel a moment when he broke psychologically, or do you think that you just caught him with a series of strikes and never really broke him mentally?
He never broke. Yeah, he just got tired, and I caught him. I heard him on the chin a couple of times, and then he couldn't figure out what was going on. But he never broke. I don't know what happened to him after that, but during that moment, yeah, I never felt him soften up.
Do you think that if you two had refought that fight, same age, same date, if you had refought that 10 times, how many times do you think you would have won?
I would have won most of them because stylistically, I was better put together. It was better put together to survive the game. But yeah, he was a warrior. He was a tough guy that, he, and a funny guy, because when we were mounted one time, our corners were yelling at each other, and he our corner's getting this, Maurice is getting an argument with his brother, and they're going back and forth, and it's hilarious at one point. And I look up, and he looks at me, and he laughs, because we're like, what are these guys doing? We had this total out of this moment, and we looked at each other and laughed, and we're like, this is crazy, and then went right back to it. But that told me that he was there the whole time, because I was there going, what are these guys arguing about? Like, it was totally nuts.
Well, that fight had a weird ending, because even though you definitively finished him, like, as someone who watched the fights I had a VHS with no translation. I thought it was just a knockout, that you had knocked him out, fight was over, but his brother charged in the ring and attacked you, and officially it was ruled, I believe, a no contest or disqualification because of that. Did you have any idea what was going on? Have you ever talked to Ensign and his brother about what they were doing and why I'm forgetting, Egan.
Egan, yeah.
Yeah, why Egan charged into the ring, or what was going on with that?
I know why he charged in there. It was one of the most emotional, knockdown, drag-out fights you've ever seen. Yeah, I wouldn't have blamed him for running in there. I was just surprised to see him jump up on me and throw me on my head and stuff. But yeah, that was a weird moment, because, we were both fighting for our, it was one of those moments where someone was going down, and in those last 2 minutes of rock'em sock'em craziness, you knew something bad was going to happen. But I'd also grown accustomed to the Japanese way. If you don't knock the guy out clean and clear with nothing attached to it, there's always a way to, fiddle with the system. But it was a big lesson for me to, make sure my contract and everything is square, that whatever. The rules say of Shuto that if someone enters the ring before the referee makes a decision, or before the action is called, or an 8 count starts, they had an 8 count, that there is disqualification. So technically there is a justification for it, but it is the first and only time I ever knocked out the champion and didn't actually win the fight.
So after that, you got the opportunity to fight for the UFC title against Kevin Jackson in a fight that took place in Japan. Now, famously, you armbarred him in 22 seconds. You talked about that in the book. This was one of the first of your famous game plans, where you'd notice that he planted his arm on the mat every time, and that he was ripe for an armbar. But what was plan B? If you hadn't gotten that armbar, if he had gotten out of it somehow, what was your follow-up plan?
Follow-up plan was to let him beat me to death and then come back from that near. That was just to keep the game going. I believed in my vision. It was literally a dream. I woke up out of a dream, and I was so deep in fighting that I was like, oh my God, I see it. I see the mechanics aren't connecting, and there's this little moment. And then I started believing I could do it, and then I practiced to do it. And by then I was sure I was going to do it. After that, I was just going to gut it out and try to win.
So after that, you fought Igor Zenovia, and this was a fight I was privileged to see live. An incredible moment. I don't think fans today realize how good Igor was and how big he was at the time, because he had been the champ of Extreme Fighting, which was quite a strong competitor to the UFC. It did well on pay-per-view. Igor had some draws, but he had never been finished, and he was a very well-rounded fighter. You beat him with a slam. You talk about your game plan. Because he would, when somebody tried to take him down, he would turtle around and wrap himself, so he was perfect for a slam. But I never realized, seeing it live, how hard the canvas was.
Yeah.
Like, But what was your plan B for Igor? If you hadn't finished him with that slam, what are you going to do with this guy?
Yeah, I didn't really have a plan B for Igor. This after the armbar thing, I was like, whoa, I must be, in this moment. So I really believed that the slam would stun him enough that I could advance to a position where he would be recovering from this slam, and I could advance to holds or choke holds, or I could, put him to sleep before he got fully recovered. I didn't know the slam was going to destroy him and knock him out and everything else. But I was always also prepared for the plan B, the knockdown, drag out thing. But with him, I didn't have one. I was very scared of his striking and his ability to control the stand-up position, and what he'd done with Mario Sperry and what he'd done with everybody in the world. He was dangerous, and I was dangerous, but in a sporting way. He was dangerous in a punch you in the head, smash you kind of way, and he was scary.
So, you ended up ending his career. You broke his collarbone, displaced some stuff in his shoulder, and you talk about the book running into him again a few years later. What was that like?
It was just weird because I carried around that, I was all worried about him and had this, God, it was years and years later. I had this, pain for him because I hurt him. I knew I hurt him. And, I'm a soldier, but it's like, I don't want to hurt somebody. But sitting next to him, he just laughed like it was nothing. Oh, it was the funniest thing in the world, but he just laughed it off. And he just told me it's a fight, it's a fight. And I mean, he imparted some wisdom to me, on that day, because it was like, it's a fight. It's true. It's if we roll the dice, then you look at them and then you go, well, there it is. There's not much else to do about it.
Yeah. The next fight you had was a sort of a short notice bout against Jeremy Horn, who at the time was completely unheralded, and you took it. This fight was a weird thing. It was like not on the main card. It was added as a bonus to pay-per-view later. I think it was on the VHS. But Jeremy Horn very nearly beat you. You pulled it out with a knee bar in the last minutes of overtime, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
Had you been in shape, though, do you think that Horn at that time would have been a particularly big challenge for you? Or I mean, do you think he was that good, or did he just catch you at a moment when you weren't prepared?
Oh, he definitely caught me at a moment that I was unprepared. And take nothing away from him, he came out to be a great fighter and had a wonderful career. But yeah, I mean, I was segueing into brand spokesman and commentary dude and all that stuff. And, they told me I was going to get an easy fight. They told me I was going to, because my deal was I was going to help a pay-per-view show that we couldn't afford to throw. It's back in the dark days of the UFC. And we couldn't afford to do a whole show. So I go, look, their idea was, I'd fight the first fight of the night, go back and change into my suit and then come out and commentate, and we'd sell this pay-per-view. So I didn't train hard. I wasn't ready. I was worried about commentary. And, his strategy was great, hold me down and get me tired, because I just didn't have the cardio. I think I did 3 days of cardio for the whole fight. And I got tired in the first 2 minutes.
When you got the opportunity for the knee bar at the end of that fight, was that something he had shown you earlier in the fight, or was it just truly in that second he put his leg in the wrong place and you saw the opportunity, or was it something you had seen earlier in the fight?
Wrong place at the wrong time, and it happens when you turn your back on somebody. When you have a system that flows, if there's something between your legs, you always wrap and roll or pick it up. And I was so tired. You saw, I literally was like, ugh, oh, there it is, ugh. Like it was, it was a technical error on his part that, helped me win that.
So the next fight that you had, this is one you didn't talk about in your book, although you made sort of an allusion to doing some pro wrestling in Japan, but you fought Kiyoshi Tamura in rings. And I've always wondered, was that a predetermined fight? Was that a pro wrestling match, or was that more like a pancrase? Was it a shoot or a work?
It was a shoot. Yeah, they were like, hey, you want to fight tomorrow? Yeah.
So talk about that fight, because that fight, you didn't get a definitive finish on Tamura, although there were, I think, several rope escapes in that bout.
Yeah.
This is a guy that was considered was the ace of rings for a long time. Why do you think he never became a mixed martial arts star? Why didn't he do well in Pride, or why is he kind of forgotten now? And where do you rank him?
Well, he was one of the best athletes of that era, back when they would call us twins, him and I. I was the American Tamura. And I mainly fought him because he was such a dynamic looking guy. I just think personality wise, he never got through. He was kind of a reserved guy, and he just never popped. I thought he was really cool, and I really enjoyed him. Even trained with him after we fought. But yeah, he seemed to be, forgotten. Our match was wonderful. I mean, I learned so much about grappling and about him, and I totally underestimated him when I went in there. I thought I was gonna just whoop him.
Where do you rank him among your best opponents? Like, is he in the top 5, top 10?
I would say, definitely top 5. Yeah, because he was a super, super skilled guy, and I just think he came in at the wrong time, and his striking wasn't that powerful. And when he moved into MMA, he didn't make that striking, strong enough, I think, to compete with the bigger guys he was going against.
How do you think that fight would have been different if it happened in UFC rules?
Oh, it'd have been, yeah. I don't think he was ready to get hit by me. And I was sort of going with that whole bravado thing, and I'm tough and all that at the time. I was a big macho guy. So I don't know if he was ready for that. And seeing how I moved into pride and stuff, or moved into the next career and didn't do well with punches, I don't think he would have been ready for the punches.
All right. And so this leads us to the apex of your career, the Tito Ortiz fight, which I still think one of my top 3 fights ever in UFC history, and as a fan to see it live was just the most incredible thing, because Tito was this huge bully. He's one of the first guys who weight cut. So he must have had, how big do you think his weight advantage was in that fight?
I think he was about 220.
And you were 190?
I was 189 or 90 pounds.
I mean, that's just an enormous size differential, and not something we see in modern MMA. And you knew that going in. One thing I wanted to ask you about, like your former teammates at the Lions Den, Jerry Bolander, Guy Metzger, they had run into trouble with Tito because the fight tended to be Tito taking them down, them trying to get back up, and Tito punishing them as they fought to try to get back to their feet. I assume you watched that because you just stayed on your back. Once he took you down, you stayed at home in the guard. Was that something that you had done deliberately from watching Bolander and Metzger's losses?
Well, I just never had the wrestling strength. Those guys were wrestlers, Bolander, and they were wrestlers. So when it came down to it, they would wrestle. I never had that ability. And also, Tito was so much bigger than me. I knew that I had to, pull him in, hold him, move around instead of try to go against him. If I'd have went against him, I'd have got tired. In 5 minutes, he'd have beat me up like those other guys. So, yeah, I mean, my goal was to go around the energy and go around the power. Very classic jiu-jitsu, sambo type strategy. And I knew he wasn't a strong vascular guy. I hung out with him. I partied with him. I was like, yeah, he's not, he's like I was 5 years ago when I didn't know vascular. And I was able to take advantage of him in that way.
And so it's visible when you watch the fight that you're talking to him when he's on top of you. What were you saying to him?
I told him I was going to get him tired. I was going to knock him out. I told him all kinds of terrible stuff. And at one point he stuck his fingers in my head. So I told him I was yelling at him for that.
So,
I used to talk her.
So when did you feel him break?
I felt him break on, God, it wasn't until the end. It wasn't until the very end right before I flipped him. And it's just that he, God bless him, he was so focused and was driving it. I mean, I felt like I was riding a horse because he just kept going and going and going. But I could feel that he didn't know where to go anymore. And he was looking for a place just to chill. And it wasn't happening for him. So psychologically, he was just getting weighed on. And then the moment it happened was when the flip happened. Because then I was like, oh my God, here it is. This is maybe the only chance I'm going to get out.
So after that fight, you retired from the UFC, and you talk about in the book that you did it partly because you saw where the business was going, that they just frankly didn't have a viable business. They weren't able to promote you, but you've had a feeling the sport would be big in a few years, and that you were saving yourself essentially for a bigger platform. On the other hand, people like Boss Rutten, Boss has been at various times said that he felt like you were ducking him, that he came into the UFC right around that time, and he became the heavyweight champion. Did you ever get an offer to fight Boss Rutten? Is there anything to that view of things?
I never got an offer, although Boss and his manager called me one time and were like, we want to fight, and I was the champ. So I actually tried to stir up interest for it. And it was just at a weird time. UFC was dying. I was becoming a free agent and sort of stepping away from it, and we never connected. I had 3 fights, but they never won the UFC.
How do you think a 4th fight in the UFC would have gone?
Um, well, hopefully in my favor.
But what would you do? Because Boss Rutten, when he can punch, is a whole different animal
Oh
from
yeah,
Boss Rutten
he and
slap
kick. I
fighting.
mean, the first time he kicked me, like it was like a car hit me. I mean, it was terrible. Um, and he really got the striking and the understanding of striking, which took me a long time to figure out. But yeah, I mean, I hope I would have won. You know, I certainly really felt like I would have back in the day.
If I can go in the land of make believe for a little while, there were some fighters that around at that time, and Rickson Gracie was the man in that era, or the one with the biggest reputation. Did you ever seriously think about fighting him, or ever have an opportunity? Any discussion of that? And if so, what would your game plan been against Rickson?
I never had an opportunity to fight him, although it's been teased about a few times and this and that. He was extremely expensive and capitalized on that in Japan. And I never even studied him, to be honest with you. I watched him grapple a few times at like a grappling thing, but I got that he was protecting his brand and he wasn't going to fight anybody tough, so I didn't really focus on it.
I see. What about Ken? And now Ken went into pro wrestling right around that time. But let's say you had to fight Ken after the Tito Ortiz fight. What would your game plan been for Ken Shamrock in 1999?
Ken, it would have been kick, straight punches down the center, let him take me down. Same, almost exactly as Tito, because they're basically the same style. It's just Tito was younger and bigger and had by then stronger wrestling and striking. But yeah, pretty much the same strategy. And then I wouldn't let him grab my legs or anything.
Wise words. So you were in pretty heavy negotiations with Pride, with the goal, you wanted to fight Sakuraba, and they offered you like a 15 days notice. You had to be within 15 pounds. Did you ever? I mean, how close did you come to signing that deal? Was that just too crazy for you, or?
That was too crazy for me. I had a long-term vision for the sport, my brand, and everything, and that doesn't sound sporting to me. And I was, as the first middleweight champion, when they brought weight classes in the UFC, it was like, this is taking a step backwards to have all these variables. Plus, I understood Japan, and it's like I knocked a guy out and I didn't even win.
Yeah. So you knew, I mean, it seems pretty obvious that if you had signed that deal, that you would have found yourself in the cage with Wanderlei Silva or somebody. I mean, in the ring with Wanderlei Silva or somebody like that. Had you gamed it that far? Like, had you ever thought about fighting Wanderlei Silva at that point in time?
Yeah, they actually mentioned him to me because he was really hot at the time, and I loved his style and loved what he was putting out there. I was mainly focused on the American audience and building my brand over here. So 15 days, 15 pounds didn't seem like a smart move to me. And I finally just went, no.
So when you actually, I think, appeared at Pride in the audience and went into the ring and talked to Sakuraba, at that point, had you been presented the offer? Did you think it was going to be a done deal at that point, or did you already suspect that it was going to turn fishy?
I had been presented an offer, but not the fine print, which was this, goofy stuff.
I see. So at that point, you thought it was going to happen.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Do you think is that the biggest disappointment of your career, that you never got to face Sakuraba? Or? That and fighting Ken, because those two were, the Ken thing started personal, but then became business, and then became personal again, and meant a lot to me. And then the Sakuraba thing was just, we came from the same lineage, so it's like at some point, he was my brother in a way in the martial arts, and at some point, I felt like I needed to face his style to see, where our styles were. So I don't know. It was true. I was on it for years, and then I finally made peace that it's never going to happen, and maybe it was just a dream for me, anyways. Yeah. Did you watch the UFC and Pride during that period while you were out of the game? Were you keeping up with who was who and what was what?
I watched Pride a little bit because I traveled there quite a bit, did business with Japanese, but not so much so. I stopped watching this. I always watched my friends. So Maurice Vaughan and Randy and Tito and all those guys, BJ, I always followed them. But if they weren't fighting, and I just didn't have a reason to. So
one guy that you never fought, but you did compete against in a grappling match, was Dan Henderson, the Greco-Roman Olympian. How do you think a bout with him in 1999 would have gone under UFC rules?
Oh, I'd have done really well against him in '99. That would have been good. Yeah, he's gotten a lot better since then, a lot tougher. But yeah, back then he didn't get the submission game. He did, and he didn't get the striking game that well. Hadn't had the H bomb yet. He had a lot of power, and he was so strong, and he was really really tough. But he just didn't have a well-rounded fighting game.
Was he one of the strongest guys you ever tied up against?
Yeah, totally. Him and Ken were like bricks. I mean, Dan, it was uncanny. Like I was like, oh God, it's wood. Like it was just bizarro. And that's where I got the idea to swing underneath his body. When I grabbed him, I went, oh my God, he's a tree. And then I went, wow, I could swing on a tree. This was my mind. I could swing on a tree. And I literally swung underneath his body. And the whole thing happened in, 20 seconds in my mind.
And then in real life as well. So you fought a couple fights, sort of in the interregnum period. You fought Cesar Gracie in the biggest fight. Still to this day, the biggest MMA crowd in U.S. history. What was that like going out after so many years off, going out in front of the biggest crowd ever for MMA?
It was nerve-wracking. Yeah, it was crazy. Plus, I developed into sort of a promoter / branding media guy and fighter guy, and I'd really evolved, sort of my understanding of the game and the promotion. There was so much riding on that show. It was just such a big moment, being the first ever legal show in California, and Shamrock and Gracie. And I just kept spinning it, but I was sure nervous. I hosted the weigh-ins live with the 5 o'clock news. Like it was the media interest was amazing, and I had grown into this. I was so comfortable with the media then, and I could just do it. I was on it. I was killing it, and it was really a special time. Yeah.
So, as part of your exile from MMA, when Zuffa bought the UFC, you were involved with them. You were an early announcer, and you talk about you even trained Dana White for a while. Why did things never work out with you guys?
I just I had different beliefs, and then when decision time came, I didn't sign with the UFC and the new company and the new vision because it wasn't concrete. It didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to me at the time. My vision made sense. These other opportunities I had, they made sense. So I followed them. And unfortunately, they didn't take well to that because I wasn't on their team. And we've been on opposing sides of the fence ever since then.
And so you talk about in the book the heartbreak you felt when they bought Strikeforce. Do you think? Explain what you felt like when because you. Other than Scott Coker, you had as much to do with building Strikeforce as anybody. You were their main star early on. You were involved behind the scenes. What was that like when you heard that the Death Star had taken over?
It was devastating. It was just, it was devastating, because, the UFC, for all their good, they locked up the sport and they, closed a lot of channels and they changed the culture of why people are fighting and what they want from it, and Strikeforce was another chance to start a new culture and to have it be martial arts. And somewhere we got away from what we were doing, which was martial arts. It just happened to be in a cage and happened to be cool and exciting. And Scott offered that, and he also offered a place to go if your UFC journey wasn't making you happy. So it just felt like our chance for, something to change and be fresh and new. It just felt like it was gone, and everything. I've sold a lot of companies, good and bad, bankrupted some. I've had all kinds of success and not. But that was something very personal that was involved with this sport that I love. And it just felt like we lost that day.
So do you think that window has closed, or do you think that there's room and possibility for such a virtuous competitor to the UFC to emerge in the next few years?
I think there's a possibility. I think it's going to take a global, consortium at this point because the UFC just has so much power and leverage, and but the beauty of martial arts, they come in all forms, mixed martial arts, kickboxing, boxing. I believe you'll see resurgence of all combat sports and in through society because it's where we're at. People need an outlet to, express themselves.
Cool. One of the things that was fun about the 90s was all the different rule sets where people were experimenting. And people don't really think about that now, but K1 was invented right around the time UFC started. Pancrase was brand new when the UFC started. Are there any rule sets that you think you'd like to see explored again? I mean, would you like catch wrestling rules, wrestling with submissions but actual shoots? What do you think the biggest possibility is for a different rule set?
Besides knee boxing, which is one I always wanted to create.
Explain what that would be.
Boxing with knees. I'd say and you can't clinch, so you got to throw the knee from a distance, which sort of exposes you. But you can knee the lower body, and that'll slow down this whole 12-round thing because you take 4 or 5 knees to your legs, and you're not going to be running anywhere. I just think that combat and combative sports is just a wonderful way to express yourself and to make yourself healthy. And it doesn't matter the rule set. I mean, it's all exciting. This whole new glory concept they got where they basically taken the best kickboxers in the world and thrown them in a potluck and they're all just going old school tournament. It's like, that's what this sport is about. Guys taking risks in combative situations. And I just think they're all awesome. I even like the old Contender days when it was like me and Dan. That to me I was so in love with grappling, and to see Olympians and all of us in one room, like sweating it out and trying to figure out the styles and stuff. That was really intriguing to me.
So you talk a lot about your fight with Kung Lee and Strikeforce, and you talk about his style that you felt he would wear himself out. But you also, in the course of that fight, I think he surprised you with how effective his techniques were. Do you think that kind of Sanshao-based striking approach has a lot of room to grow in MMA, or do you think he's kind of a one-off?
Well, similar styles of striking have plenty of room to grow, and that is just understanding the distance and range and angles, and then having a system that is consistent. You can damage and not get damaged. I don't think he's an anomaly because the way martial arts are growing into mixed martial arts and UFC and everything's turning into one, thing. You see John Jones spinning and twirling, and he's breaking all the rules. He's creating his own style because it works for him. But yeah, I love what he does. And the problem with his style is it takes a lot of energy, to move like that. You have to either be super conditioned or, be an expert to where you're not expending energy.
Is John Jones the fighter you think that is on the avant-garde today? Like, who's at the pinnacle of MMA evolution right now? Is there anybody you're watching that you think is really innovative?
I think John Jones is 5 steps ahead of the rest of the pack right now.
Cool. If I've just got a couple minutes left, if I could ask one last question, who would you pick in an Anderson Silva John Jones fight if they put that together?
I would go with John Jones.
Just the physical size and youth.
And speed and wrestling and, yeah.
What do you think the fighter that can beat John Jones, what's the template for somebody beating John Jones is?
Somebody taller? I don't know. I don't think the problem is I don't think it exists yet. He's too long, too fast. He has angles. It's like Muhammad Ali. He has angles that don't exist. He makes them exist. He gets it and has created his own style to, roll with. Dan did that, but Dan's the last generation. He's with me. There's a new breed coming, and John's, the prototype.
Okay, last question. What are your thoughts on the injury epidemic right now that's canceling so many fights? Do you think guys are overtraining? Are they overusing performance enhancers that weaken their ligaments? What do you think's going on, and what would you tell young fighters today that are competing at a high level that you think they need to change?
Well, I think a lot of that's cultural. We got a culture where if you lose, you're gone. You take 9 steps back instead of 1. You're not considered a star unless you're winning at the highest level, and it's like, that's a tough sport to be in. So a lot of guys don't want to take the risk anymore. They don't want to go out there unless they're 1,000%. And you're never that guy in this sport. It's too hard. For the young guys, you just got to listen to your body because your body's going to let you know if you're training too hard, training too long. And then if you can't listen to your body, find someone who knows how to listen to your body, and he'll whack you over the head and tell you when to stop. But a lot of this is overtraining, and a lot of this is under-risking Because why would I risk everything when what am I getting in return? I'm going to get money. That doesn't do it. You know, that only lasts until 3 months from now, and then I still got to have a job, and I still got to have all these things.
Well, cool. Well, thanks so much for joining us, Frank. The book is Uncaged by Frank Shamrock, and it's excellent. I highly recommend it. Easily the top of MMA autobiographies I've written, and enjoyed it very much. Frank, thanks so much for joining us.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure.